Elara did not know how long she sat there in that dim corridor, humming the old songs of her childhood to an alien being. Older than human history itself, time seemed to lose its meaning in that quiet space between two souls who had never met but somehow understood each other. Ambassador Kethvaren's crystal form pulsed with soft light that grew warmer as the minutes passed, and the sound she made shifted from that lonely rhythm of grief into something curious and reaching, like a hand extended in the darkness, hoping to find another hand reaching back. When Elara finally stopped humming, the silence that followed was not empty, it was full. It was the kind of silence that happens between old friends who do not need words to know what the other is thinking. The ambassador made a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, and though Elara could not translate it into any language she knew, she felt its meaning settle into her chest like warmth on a cold night. It meant thank you. It meant I see you. It meant please do not go. Elara smiled and made a small gesture with her hand, touching her heart and then extending her palm toward the ambassador. A simple movement she had learned from her mother, who had learned it from her mother, passed down through generations of people who had nothing to offer but their presence and their characterference. Light flickered in what Elara somehow knew was surprise, and then the ancient being repeated the gesture with one of her crystalline limbs, touching the center of her form where something pulsed like a heartbeat of pure light. They had no shared language, they had no common words, but in that moment they had something far more important. They had understanding. Taylor returned to that corridor every night after her shift ended, when the diplomatic quarter was quiet and the important people had gone to their comfortable beds, and each time she found Ambassador Kethvaren waiting for her in the dim hallway like a friend expecting a visitor. They developed their own way of being together. Elara would hum songs from her childhood, and the ambassador would respond with melodies of her own, frequencies that vibrated in Elara's bones and made her feel emotions she had no names for, ancient feelings from a species that had watched stars being born. Sometimes Elara would talk, not expecting the ambassador to understand her words, but knowing somehow that the meaning would carry through. And she would tell stories of her life on New Manila, of the crowded streets and the smell of rain on hot metal, of her mother's hands worn rough from factory work, and her father's laugh that could fill a room even when there was nothing to laugh about. She talked about hunger and hope. She talked about the way poor people learned to read each other because their lives depended on it. How a child in the slums could tell from the set of someone's shoulders whether they meant harm or help. How survival taught you to feel what others were feeling before your mind had time to think about it. Kethvaren listened not to the words, because those meant nothing to her, but to the feeling behind them, to the rise and fall of emotion that colored every sound Elara made, and slowly, carefully, like someone learning to walk again after a long illness, the ambassador began to share her own stories. In return, she sang about her people, the Vaethi, and though Elara could not understand the specifics, she felt the shape of what was being told. There had been a civilization that stretched across 100 star systems, beings of light and crystal who had lived for millions of years and had watched the universe grow from chaos into order. They had been the first, or at least among the first, and they had taken it upon themselves to plant seeds of life on barren worlds, not for power or resources, but because they believed that consciousness was precious, that awareness was the universe's way of knowing itself, and that every new species was a gift to be celebrated. They had been gardeners of worlds, they had been teachers and guides and protectors, and then, slowly, over millions of years, they had faded not through war or disaster, but through a quiet exhaustion that came from living too long, from watching too many of their children grow up and forget them, from carrying the weight of memory until it became too heavy to bark. Kethvaren was the last. She had volunteered to stay when the others chose to end their long journey. to remain behind as a witness and a keeper of memories, to wait for the right moment to return and see what their children had become. She had been alone for 3,000 years, traveling through the empty dark between galaxies, carrying her people's story with no one to share it with, hoping that when she finally arrived, she would find someone who could understand, and instead she had found a galaxy of advanced civilizations who looked at her like a problem to be solved, a code to be cracked, a resource to be extracted. No one had simply sat with her. No one had hummed lullabies in the dark and asked nothing in return until Alara's weeks passed and their strange friendship deepened. But Alara knew it could not stay secret forever. One night she arrived at the corridor to find a Zithrani security officer waiting with arms crossed and eyes narrowed in suspicion. "What are you doing in a restricted area?" the officer demanded, and Alara felt her stomach drop because she knew what this looked like. A lowly human janitor sneaking around where she did not belong. Before she could answer, Ambassador Kathviren emerged from her quarters in a blaze of light brighter than Alara had ever seen. The sounds she made were sharp and commanding, and though no one could translate them, the meaning was unmistakable. "This human is welcome here. This human is my guest. Leave us alone." The Mivus Unmano Zithrani officer stepped back in shock, and within hours the news had spread across the entire station. A human janitor had made contact with the ambassador. A human janitor was communicating with the ancient being that the greatest minds in the galaxy had failed to reach. The council demanded to see Alara immediately, dragging her from her quarters before she even had time to change out of her work clothes. And she found herself standing in a chamber of marble and gold surrounded by the most powerful beings in the known universe, all of them staring at her like she was some kind of puzzle they could not solve. "How did you do it?" the Zithrani representative demanded. "What technology did you use?" The Thalixians asked. "Tell us your method so we can replicate it properly." The Marvathi insisted. Ella looked at them and felt something twist in her chest. They did not understand at all. There was no technology, there was no method. There was just a lonely woman who recognized another lonely soul and sat down beside her in the dark. "I did not do anything special," Alara said quietly. "I just listened." The council exchanged glances of frustration. "That cannot be all," someone said. "There must be something more," but there was not. There was nothing more complicated than simple human presence. The ancient skill of being with someone in their pain without trying to fix it or analyze it or turn it into something useful. And that, Alara was beginning to understand, was exactly what the Vayathi language had been built on. Not information transfer, not data exchange, connection, pure and simple and profound. The kind of connection that no machine could replicate and no algorithm could decode. The kind of connection that came from suffering and surviving and learning to feel what others felt. The kind of connection that humanity, for all its youth and weakness, had never lost. The ship came out of the darkness between galaxies, and every alarm on Unity Station screamed at once. It was old beyond measure, built from metals that no scanner could identify, powered by engines that broke every known law of physics, and it moved through space like a ghost returning home after 1,000 lifetimes away. The Galactic Council had waited 3,000 years for this moment. Every species that had ever looked up at the stars knew the stories of the Vayathi, the ancient ones who had walked among the first fires of creation itself, the beings who had seeded life across 100 star systems before vanishing into the endless dark. And now, against all hope and expectation, one of them had returned. Ambassador Kathviren stepped onto Unity Station, and the gathered diplomats fell silent in awe. She was not like anything they had imagined. Her body was made of living crystal that shifted and flowed like water frozen in mid-motion. and light moved through her in patterns that seemed to carry meaning beyond what eyes could understand. And when she spoke, the sounds that emerged were like wind moving through ruins older than time. Itself clicks and hums in frequencies that spanned spectrums most species could not even perceive filled the air around hers. The Zethrani delegation was the first to step forward, their quantum linguistic algorithms humming with confidence, their translators calibrated to crack any code in the known universe. But after 3 hours of analysis, their lead scientist stepped back with confusion written across every feature of his elongated face. The algorithms had found nothing. The Morvathi came next, offering their legendary hive mind consensus translation, a system that had united 12 separate species under one banner of understanding. But the ambassador's words slipped through their collective consciousness like sand through fingers, leaving only static and the distant echo of meaning that vanished before it could be grasped. The Thalixian Empire deployed neural sync technology that had broken every language barrier in their long history of conquest. Technology that could reach into minds and pull meaning directly from thought itself. But when they tried to connect with Ambassador Kathviron, their operators collapsed with nosebleeds and migraines, overwhelmed by the sheer depth and age of what they had touched week after week. The greatest minds in the galaxy tried and failed. The ambassador would gesture toward stars that had burned out millions of years ago, singing frequencies that made translation devices short-circuit and spark. And sometimes she would weep in colors that no species present had names for, shades of sorrow that painted the air around her like visible grief. The council grew frustrated. Here was knowledge that could reshape the galaxy. Warnings, perhaps, of dangers yet to come, or gifts of technology beyond imagination, or wisdom gathered across 3,000 years of solitary wandering. And none of it could be accessed because no one could understand a single word. 6 months passed and despair began to settle over the diplomatic quarter like a fog that would not lift. Scientists argued in hallways about the nature of Vayathi communication. Politicians demanded results that no one could provide. And slowly the excitement of first contact faded into the bitter taste of failure. Ambassador Kathviron grew quieter as the months dragged on. Her crystal form dimmed from the bright radiance. She had carried on a rival to something softer and sadder, like a star beginning its long, slow fade into darkness. And she spent more and more time alone in the quarters the council had provided, away from the endless parade of experts who poked and prodded at her like she was a puzzle to be solved rather than a person to be understood. No one noticed the change in her. No one thought to ask if she was all right. They were too busy running their algorithms and calibrating their machines, too focused on the problem of translation to see the obvious truth that sat right in front of them. She was lonely. She was the last of her kind, a survivor of a species that had watched the birth of stars and the death of worlds. And she had traveled alone through the empty spaces between galaxies for longer than most civilizations had existed, carrying the weight of her people's memory with no one to share it with. And now she sat, surrounded by beings who wanted her knowledge but could not see her pain. The diplomatic quarter of Unity Station was a place of marble floors and golden light, of dignitaries in fine robes and technology that gleamed with the polish of wealth and power. But beneath all that grandeur, in the maintenance tunnels and service corridors that kept the station running, there was another world. Entirely, this was where the workers lived, the cleaners and mechanics and janitors who scrubbed carbon, scoring from ventilation shafts and repaired broken conduits and kept the garbage from piling up, while the great powers of the galaxy argued about matters far above their station. Most of them were. Humanity was still new to the galactic stage, a young species from a small planet that had only recently discovered faster than light travel. and they had not yet earned the respect of the older civilizations, so they took the jobs that no one else wanted. The work that was invisible and thankless and necessary. Ella Vance was one of these workers. She was 32 years old, with calloused hands and tired eyes. And she had grown up in the industrial slums of New Manila, a colony world where children learn to read faces before they learn to read words, where survival meant understanding the moods of dangerous people and the silences that came before violence. She had never been to university. She had never received formal education beyond basic reading and writing. What she had was a lifetime of watching and listening and understanding what people really meant beneath the words they spoke. A skill born not from privilege, but from necessity, from the desperate need to know when to run and when to hide and when to offer comfort to a mother who was trying not to cry. She had taken the job on Unity Station because it paid in galactic credits that she could send home to her family, and because it offered meals that meant she did not have to choose between eating and paying rent. She had learned to be invisible here, to move through spaces where diplomats and scientists never thought to look, to clean up their messes without being seen or acknowledged. She knew about the Vayathi ambassador the same way everyone on the station knew. She had heard the rumors of failure, the whispers of frustration, the jokes that the ancient alien had come all this way just to speak nonsense at people who could not understand. But she had never seen the ambassador herself, not until the night a maintenance error sent her into a restricted corridor she was never supposed to enter, and she found herself standing in the dim hallway outside the Vayathi delegation's quarters, and there, sitting alone in the shadows, was Ambassador Kethviran. Her light was so dim she was almost invisible, and the sounds coming from her were soft and rhythmic, like a heartbeat made of music, like something old and sad and private. Tilara recognized that rhythm immediately. It was the same pattern her grandmother had made when she rocked in her chair after grandfather died. It was the same sound her mother hummed when the money ran out, and there was nothing left to do but wait for morning. It was grief, it was loneliness, it was the universal language of someone who had lost everything and found themselves surrounded by strangers who could not see their pain. Lara stood in that hallway and felt her heart break for this ancient being who had crossed galaxies only to sit alone in the dark and without thinking, without planning, without any idea of what she was doing or why. She sat down on the cold metal floor across from the ambassador. She did not speak. She did not try to communicate. She simply hummed an old lullaby from New Manila, a song her mother had sung when the world was too heavy to bear, a song about rain on metal rooftops and the promise that somehow, someway, morning would come again. Ambassador Kethviran's dim light slowly began to brighten. She turned toward the human sitting on the floor, and for the first time in 6 months, her sound shifted into something new. It was a question. It was hope. It was the first real connection anyone had made with her since she arrived. The council chamber was the grandest room Alara had ever stood in. Walls of white marble rose toward a ceiling painted with the stars of 1,000 worlds, and seats carved from rare woods and precious metals curved in rows around the central platform, where speakers addressed the most powerful beings in the known galaxy. Ella stood on that platform and felt smaller than she had ever felt in her life. She was wearing borrowed clothes that did not quite fit, formal robes in diplomatic gray that scratched against her skin and made her feel like a child playing dress-up in her mother's closet. Around her sat representatives of every major civilization. The Zethrani, with their elongated faces and eyes that glowed with quantum calculations, the Morvathi collective, 12 beings moving in perfect synchronization, like one mind spread across many bodies. The Thalixian Empress in her golden armor, surrounded by guards who could kill everyone in the room with a single thought, and dozens of others species Alara had no names for. Beings who had crossed light years of space to hear what the ancient ambassador had to say. Ambassador Kethviran stood beside her, blazing with light brighter than any Alara had seen before, and the sound she was making filled the chamber with music that was beautiful and terrible and older than the stones beneath their feet. Alara took a deep breath and began to speak. She did not try to translate word for word, because that was impossible. Instead, she tried to explain what the ambassador was feeling. The context behind her gestures, the weight of her silences, the meaning of the colors that rippled across her crystalline form. She is not delivering a report, Alara said, her voice small in that vast space. She is telling a story. The council shifted. With impatience, they had not come for stories. They wanted data. Facts, information they could use. But Alara pressed on. She is telling us about her people, the Vayathi, who were the first gardeners of life in this galaxy. She is telling us about beings who lived for millions of years and spent those years planting seeds of consciousness on barren worlds, not because they wanted to rule those worlds, but because they believed that awareness was precious, that every new species was a gift worth celebrating. She is telling us a love story, a eulogy for a people who are gone, a letter written across 3,000 years to children they never stopped caring about. Council fell silent. Catherine's song shifted and deepened, and Alara listened with her heart instead of her ears. But she has also come with a warning. Alara continued, a truth that her people learned through watching civilizations rise and fall for millions of years. She says that you have grown powerful beyond anything the Vayathi imagines. She says that your technology is remarkable. Your empires are vast. Your achievements would make her ancestors weep with pride. But she also says that you have lost something along the way, something that cannot be measured or optimized or built with machines. She says you have forgotten how to connect. The chamber stirred with discomfort. Representatives exchanged glances of confusion and irritation. This was not what they had expected. This was not what they wanted to hear. Alara swallowed her fear and kept speaking. She says that your translators and communicators and neural link devices are not signs of advancement, but signs of decay. They are crutches you have built because you can no longer understand each other naturally. She says that your entertainment industries exist because you can no longer enjoy simply being in each other's presence. She says that your therapy protocols and mental health systems are necessary because you have lost the ability to comfort each other in pain. She says that you are becoming what the Vayathi feared most. Beings who are intelligent but alone, capable of crossing galaxies but unable to cross the distance between hearts. The Thalixian Empress rose from her seat with anger flashing in her eyes. How dare you, she said, her voice cold as space itself. How dare this primitive human stand before us and tell us that we are failing? We have conquered 1,000 worlds. We have built wonders that would break your feeble human mind to comprehend. We have achieved perfection in every measurable way. And you tell us that we are missing something because we cannot sit in the dark and sing lullabies? Alara felt her knees shaking, but she did not step back. That is exactly what she is telling you, Alara said quietly. And that is exactly what you just proved. The chamber erupted in noise. Some representatives shouted in anger. Others laughed in dismissal. A few sat in thoughtful silence. But Ambassador Kethviran raised one crystalline limb, and the room fell silent as if struck by a blow. She sang one long, mournful note that vibrated through the floor and walls and ceiling, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of 3,000 years of loneliness and hope and grief. And then she did something no one expected. She gestured toward Alara, and her light pulsed in a pattern that everyone in the room could somehow understand without translation. This one, the gesture said, this human from a forgotten colony, this janitor who cleans your floors and empties your waste. She heard me when none of you could. She sat with me in my pain when none of you thought to ask if I was suffering. She knew what I needed. before I could find the words to ask for it, and that is why I chose her. That is why humanity is the only species in this galaxy that gives me hope. Silence fell over the council chamber, heavy and uncomfortable and undeniable. The Veathi had not come to deliver weapons or star maps. They had not come bearing gifts of power or technology. They had come with a mirror, and what the mirror showed was not flatter Angela. Watched the representatives of 100 civilizations look at each other with new uncertainty. She saw empires built on logic and efficiency suddenly wonder if they had optimized away the very thing that made life worth living. She saw ancient species who had not questioned their path in millennia suddenly doubt the direction they had chosen. Not all of them listened. Some dismissed the message as primitive sentiment, as the ramblings of an ancient being who had lost touch with reality, but others were shaken in ways they could not articulate, and a precious few, looked at the human janitor standing on the platform and saw her for the first time, not as a Tofos time, not as a Patriotus Jurim, not as standing on the platform, and saw her for the first time, not as a Pia, lesser being from a young species, not as a curiosity or a tool to be used, but as someone who carried something they had lost, something precious, something they might be able to learn again if they were willing to sit in the dark and listen. The council did not believe her. They could not accept that the answer to their 6 months of failure was something as simple as sitting in the dark and humming lullabies. There had to be more to it. They insisted, some hidden talent or secret technique that the human was holding back. Some method that could be studied and copied and applied by their own experts. They brought in specialists to examine. Elara neural scanners mapped her brain, looking for unusual patterns. Genetic analysts combed through her DNA, searching for some mutation that might explain her ability. Psychologists asked her endless questions about her childhood and her training and her thought processes. They found nothing special. Era was exactly what she appeared to be, a poor woman from a forgotten colony with no formal education and no remarkable talents, just a lifetime of survival instincts and a heart that had learned to feel what others felt. The Zaithrani dismissed her as a curiosity. The Thelixians suggested she was somehow tricking the ambassador through manipulation they could not detect. But Ambassador Kethviran refused to speak with anyone else. Every time the council sent their linguists and diplomats to attempt communication, the ancient being would dim her light and fall silent, waiting in stillness until they left. And then she would brighten again when Elara arrived with her quiet presence and her gentle songs. The council had no choice if they wanted any hope of understanding the Veathi message. They needed the human janitor, so they assigned Elara as an official liaison, gave her a small room in the diplomatic quarter that felt too clean and too empty after a lifetime in crowded spaces, and told her to figure out what the ambassador was trying to say. Elara did not know how to be a diplomat. She did not know the proper protocols or the formal phrases or the delicate dance of galactic politics. All she knew was how to sit with someone who was hurting and let them know they were not alone. So that was what she did every day. She would meet with Ambassador Kethviran in a quiet garden the station had created for the Veathi delegation, a small space filled with plants from 100 worlds that bloomed in colors Elara had never seen before. They would sit together among the flowers. Kethviran would sing, and Elara would listen, not trying to translate or analyze, but simply absorbing the feeling of what was being shared, and slowly, like learning to see in the dark, Elara began to understand the Veathi language was not like any language she had ever encountered. It did not work through words or grammar or syntax. It worked through resonance. Every sound the ambassador made carried emotional weight, layers of feeling that built upon each other like colors mixing on a canvas. And the meaning of any phrase depended entirely on the relationship between speaker and listener. A sentence Spoken to a stranger meant something completely different than the same. Sentence spoken to a friend context was everything connection was everything with a genuine bond between two beings. The Vayathi language was just noise, beautiful and complex, but ultimately empty of meaning. This was why every translator had failed. They had tried to decode the ambassador's words like a puzzle, treating her speech as information to be extracted rather than emotion to be shared. But you cannot extract meaning from a Vayathi sentence any more than you can extract the warmth from a hug. It has to be experienced, it has to be felt, it has to be received by someone who is genuinely open to receiving. Itelra could not translate in any traditional sense. She could not take the ambassador's words and convert them into galactic standard for the council to analyze, but she could feel what Kathviren was trying to communicate, could sense the shape of meaning beneath the surface, and she could try to put that feeling into words that others might understand. It was imperfect. So much was lost in the translation from emotion to language, but it was better than nothing. And slowly, piece by piece, Alara began to assemble the story that Ambassador Kathviren had carried across 3,000 years of darkness. The Vayathi had not returned with technology, or star maps or weapons. They had not come bearing gifts of power that the galaxy could use to expand its empires. They had come with a warning. Kathviren sang of her people's history, of how they had watched their children's species grow and develop and build civilizations that reached for the stars, and of how they had seen the same pattern repeat again and again across millions of years. Young species started with connection. They huddled together around fires and shared stories and felt each other's pain and joy as if it were their own. But as they grew more advanced, as their technology expanded and their empires spread across light years of space, something always began to fade. The connection weakened, the empathy dimmed. They became so focused on solving problems and gathering data and optimizing systems that they forgot how to simply be with each other. They built translation devices because they could no longer understand each other naturally. They created entertainment because they could no longer enjoy each other's company. They developed therapy protocols because they could no longer comfort each other in pain. And eventually, always, they fell not to external enemies or cosmic disasters, but to the slow rot of isolation that came from living in a universe where everyone was connected by technology and no one was connected by heart. The Vayathi had watched it happen 100 times. They had tried to warn species, tried to guide them away from the path of disconnection, but always they were too late, or too subtle, or too strange to be understood. And now they were gone, all except for Kathviren. And she had come back to try one last time to see if any of their children had learned, to see if any of them had kept a spark of genuine connection. Alara listened to this story and felt tears running down her cheeks. She thought of her mother humming in the dark, of neighbors sharing food they could not afford to share, of strangers on the street reaching out to help someone who had fallen. She thought of the slums of New Manila, where people had nothing except each other, where survival meant relying on the kindness of those around you, where connection was not a luxury, but a necessity the rich and powerful could afford to be. Alone they had technology to meet their needs and walls to keep others out, but the poor knew a secret that the wealthy had forgotten people, needed people, not for what they could provide, or what they could do, just for being there, just for seeing each other, just for sitting in the dark and humming lullabies when the world was too heavy to bear. That was what the Vayathi had been trying to teach. That was what the galaxy had forgotten, and somehow, against all odds, it was a skill that humanity had managed to keep, not because they were wise or advanced or special, but because they were still young enough and poor enough and vulnerable enough to know that they could not survive. Alanilera wiped her tears and looked at Ambassador Kethviren with new understanding. She finally knew what she needed to tell the council. She finally knew what the Vayathi message was. Now, she just had to find a way to make them listen. The months that followed the council address were complicated in ways Alara could never have predicted. Some species left Unity Station in anger, offended by the suggestion that their magnificent civilizations were somehow incomplete, and diplomatic relationships that had stood for centuries cracked under the weight of wounded pride. But others stayed. They lingered in the corridors and gardens, watching Alara and Ambassador Kethviren with curious eyes, asking questions they did not know how to ask. Seeking something they could not name, a Zithrani scientist approached Alara one evening and confessed that he had not spoken to his family in 30 years because their conversations felt inefficient. And now he wondered if efficiency was the wrong measure of a relationship. Morvathi Collective admitted that they had lost the ability to feel as individuals, that their hive mind had become so unified that no single member could experience loneliness or love or grief anymore. And they did not know if this was evolution or loss. A young Thelixium guard told Alara in whispered confidence that she had always felt different from her people, that she cried at sunsets and laughed too loud at jokes and felt the pain of others as if it were her own. And her entire life she had been told these were weaknesses to be overcome. Alara listened to all of them. She did not have answers or solutions or therapies to offer. She just sat with them the way she sat with Kethviren, present and patient and open, and somehow that was enough. Word spread through the galaxy like ripples on still water. A human had done what no other species could do. A human had understood the ancient ambassador. A human had received the message that the Vayathi had carried across 3,000 years. The council quietly appointed Alara as the permanent liaison to the Vayathi delegation, a position that had never existed before and might never exist again. And it was the first time in galactic history that a human had been elevated to such diplomatic significance. Other species whispered that it was a token gesture, a publicity move, an attempt to appear open-minded without actually changing anything. They did not understand what Kethviren saw. They could not see what she saw. Humans were young and fragile, their lives over in an eye blink compared to species that measured their histories in millions of years. They were weak, unable to survive in vacuum or extreme temperatures or high gravity. They were primitive, their technology still fumbling with problems that other civilizations had solved long ago, but they had something the older species had lost. They had an emotional depth that the ancient races had optimized away in their pursuit of perfection. They carried their evolutionary history close to the surface, the tribal bonds and survival instincts and desperate need for connection that had kept their ancestors alive on a dangerous world where other species had learned to suppress their emotions as inefficiencies. Humans had never stopped feeling, where other species had replaced genuine connection with technological substitutes. Humans still reached out to touch each other in moments of pain and joy, where other species had forgotten the old songs. Humans still hummed lullabies in the dark. This was not a weakness. This was a gift. This was the very thing the Vayathi had been searching for across 3,000 years of lonely, wandering. Ambassador Kethviren spent her remaining time on Unity Station in peace. Her light grew dimmer as the months passed, the ancient energy that had sustained her through millennia finally beginning to fade. But she was no longer alone, and that made all the difference. She taught Alara everything she could, singing stories of worlds that no longer existed and species that had risen and fallen and been forgotten, sharing memories so old they felt like dreams, passing on the wisdom of a people who had loved the universe so much they had spent their existence trying to fill it with life, and Alara listened. She recorded nothing because the Vayathi language could not be captured by machines. She wrote nothing because words on a page could never carry the weight of what was being shared. She simply absorbed it, taking the stories into her heart, where they would live as long as she lived, ready to be passed on to the next person who was willing to sit in the dark and listen. On the night Kethviren died, the station's lights flickered across every decade. Was as if the universe itself was marking the passage of something ancient and precious. A candle that had burned for millions of years finally going out, and Lara was there. She held the ambassador's crystalline hand as the light inside pulsed one last time, and she hummed the lullaby from New Manila, the song about rain on metal rooftops and the promise that morning would come. Kethviren sang something back. It was quiet, barely more than a whisper of sound and light. But Alara understood it completely. It was gratitude for being seen. It was hope for what was to come. It was a blessing, ancient and powerful, spoken in a language that no translator could ever capture. And beneath all of that, deeper than words, was a message for all of humanity. You are young, the message said, and you have far to go, and the path ahead is dangerous, but you carry something precious, a spark that the galaxy has almost forgotten. And if you can keep that spark alive, if you can remember how to feel and connect and simply be with each other, then maybe, just maybe, you can save yourselves from the fate that claims so many others. The Vayathi believed in you, the message said. We always believed in you. Do not let us down. Kethviren's light faded into darkness. The last of the Vayathi was gone, but somewhere far away, in the space between galaxies, where the departed spirits of an ancient race watched over their children, something shifted. Attention turned toward a small, unremarkable species on the edge of the galaxy. Beings who were young and fragile and foolish and brave. Beings who still held hands and sang songs and wept at sunsets and felt each other's pain. The humans, the watching spirits, agreed. Were worth watching. They were worth hoping for. They carried the spark that could light the darkness, and maybe, if they were lucky and wise and true to themselves, they would be the ones to finally break the pattern, to build an empire of connection instead of conquest, to prove that a civilization could grow powerful without growing cold, to show the galaxy that strength and compassion were not opposites but partners. Sela stood alone in the quiet room where Ambassador Kethviren had spent her last days, surrounded by the fading echo of ancient light. And she made a promise that no one else could hear. She would remember. She would teach. She would carry the story forward, and she would make sure that humanity never forgot the lesson that had cost the Vayathi everything to deliver that in all the vastness of the universe, with all its wonders and terrors and mysteries beyond counting, the most powerful force was still the simplest. One, the force of one soul reaching out to another, the force of presence and patience and love, the force that no machine could replicate and no empire could destroy, the force that had made a poor human janitor the most important diplomat in the galaxy, the force that would carry humanity forward into whatever future was waiting among the stars. This was the gift of the Vayathis, was the inheritance they left behind, and humanity, for all its flaws and failures, was ready to receive it. The spark was alive. The story would continue, and somewhere in the dark, the Ancient One smiled.